Working with the smaller customers, generally the decision makers are clear, the legal requirements are much more straightforward and clear. The onboarding and compliance stuff is much easier. And so for us, we found it's much preferable to sell to the smaller customers. Well, we have one like Fortune 100 customer. They're a very, very large company. We got approval from the plant to move forward with some of our robots after 2 weeks of conversation. Very fast.
Yeah.
And then it took 18 months to get through procurement and contracting and security compliance and cyber approvals, and every single team at the company had an opinion, and it was torture. And the reality is that the revenue that we generate from that customer is roughly similar to the revenue that we generate from a much smaller customer who happens to move much more quickly. So I think this is the era where small factories actually really have a strong advantage because they can try new things, they can be much more forward thinking, they can be much more creative and efficient compared to the large guys. We underwrite a lot of risks. Integration risk is one of them. We underwrite operational risks, we underwrite hardware risk, we underwrite performance risk. The question is, who's best positioned to underwrite and evaluate that risk? Is it the customer who makes chocolate chip cookies, or is it me who deploys robots every day? We know 10 times more about the robots, 100 times more. My slightly controversial opinion is that anybody who really cares about their customer being successful with their robot should do it.
Okay, everyone, I'm so excited to be here with Saman at his facility in Oakland, California.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Very excited. Welcome to the robot headquarters.
And Saman will help us really understand as to how he scaled up Formic Technologies and what really is Formic Technologies. So
Yeah,
the first question, what is Formic Technologies?
what we've tried to build at Formic is the easiest way for factories to automate and get robots into their facility. So we are a pretty young company. We're about 5 years old, and we have robots deployed now in about 150 factories across the US. And we've built software, we built hardware, we built a bunch of deployment and operating infrastructure so that factories can address their labor shortfall and really quickly scale up their production. So our goal is to basically be the robot workforce on demand for every factory in the world.
And that's very interesting. And in some sense, seems like you were almost accelerating automation or robotic adoption in American manufacturing companies. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think prior to this, I was a VC for many years, and I invested in lots of robotics companies, about 35, 40 different robotics companies, including Ed, who you had on your podcast last week. And one of the things that we observed is that the pace of technology progress is incredibly fast. Companies are building new robots every day that can do new things. But the pace of adoption was a lot slower than we had hoped. And the reason was it was very difficult for these end users, these factories in particular, who they may be experts in making their own kind of product. They may be, whether it's aerospace parts or dog food or whatever, but it's still very difficult for them to get the most modern robotics technologies into their plant and access it. So we tried to create a bunch of support so that it becomes extremely easy for them to adopt robotics at scale.
And what is the mechanism that you actually use to accelerate this?
Yeah, so to put it very simply, it's the idea of robots as a service.
Right.
And to add a little more granularity, that means we are responsible for the end-to-end process. So we evaluate their factory, we help them choose the robots for the job. We bring the robots and actually physically deploy them and install them. We program the robots using all the software that we've built. And then once the robot is there, we also guarantee performance and uptime. So we take care of all the maintenance, all the spare parts, all the operations, and they just pay a subscription to use it.
Yeah.
And if their needs change, we take the robot back, and we bring them a different one if they need a different kind of robot. So we basically take on all the risk, all the hard work, all the complexity of deploying robots, and in exchange, it becomes extremely easy and risk-free on behalf of the customer, and that's really what adoption was dependent on.
And you said that customers, right? And manufacturing sector in the US or anywhere in the world is actually multi-stakeholder, right? So who really is your customer in this entire gamut or spectrum of things?
Yeah, so generally the person that we sell to in the factory is either the VP of operations or head of operations, or it's actually the plant manager. Somebody who's responsible for the overall performance throughput of that specific plant in that specific factory. So even when we sell to very large companies, like some of our customers have 150 sites, still we have to sell to the individual plant one by one, because they're the ones who understand their needs, they're the ones who understand the risks, and they're the ones who are also the most desperate for robots, actually.
And are these like big manufacturing companies or suppliers to them, like OEMs or suppliers to them, or
It's a
who are
mix.
they?
The majority of our customers are like medium size, so they're a few hundred up to a few thousand employees, and that's consistent with the way that American manufacturing is. 98% of factories in America are small, medium sized businesses. And then we also have some very large companies that are customers. So they may have like 100 or 200 factories, but each plant is still a few hundred to a few thousand employees and has a very similar buying behavior to the very large customers. So we've seen that to be pretty consistent. The way that they operate, the way that they think is very similar. And the people tend to move around. So the plant manager at a small cookie factory might move to managing one product at a very, very large customer. So the people tend to move around a little bit, but the scope of work and their scope of focus tends to be pretty consistent.
I think in one of your podcasts, you mentioned that for every Ford, there are 3 to 4K suppliers, and it seems like your customers would also include these suppliers. And when I speak with founders who are building in the manufacturing space, specifically when they're building something that's very unconventional and not like a cost plus model, right? They say that they are very excited to work directly with OEMs, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you say working with a supplier is different versus working with a big manufacturing OEM?
Yeah, the reality is it's much easier. Working with the smaller customers, generally the decision makers are clear. The legal requirements are much more straightforward and clear. The onboarding and compliance stuff is much easier. And so for us, we found it's much preferable to sell to the smaller customers. I'll give you an example. We have one like Fortune 100 customer. They're a very, very large company. We got approval from the plant to move forward with some of our robots after 2 weeks of conversation, very fast. Yeah. And then it took 18 months to get through procurement and contracting and security compliance and cyber approvals, and every single team at the company had an opinion, and it was torture. And the reality is that the revenue that we generate from that customer is roughly similar to the revenue that we generate from a much smaller customer who happens to move much more quickly. So I think this is the era where small factories actually really have a strong advantage, because they can try new things, they can be much more forward thinking, they can be much more creative and efficient compared to the large guys.
Did you always know that, or was it a discovery process?
It definitely was a discovery. I think it's very seducing to imagine, so and so huge company is going to buy 100 robots, 500 robots all at once. And the reality is, like, the startup world is littered with the corpses of companies who took that approach, because they may sign a LOI for 500 robots, but what they actually deploy is typically much, much less than that and much, much slower. The other thing that's really bad about big companies is they have innovation teams whose job is to try new things, which in theory sounds good, but in practice, it's a bunch of people who are paid to waste your time. They love, meeting every single startup, spending time with every single startup, running a proof of concept. The way that they demonstrate value in their organization is that they bring every cool thing to a PowerPoint deck and present it to the leadership team.
Right.
That's their KPI.
Yeah.
Successful deployment is not typically their KPI. So, it can end up being a very big time suck for a startup trying to sell to the manufacturing sector.
I think one thing that's very interesting is that you've really seen phases, right, when it comes to how Formic has scaled. So as of last year, you had around 100 customers, right? So why don't you walk us through your journey of scaling it from 0 to 10, 10 to 50, and 50 to 100? Because clearly it was a discovery process. So what did you learn? And if I were to ask you today, what would you really change about your process, if at all?
So the first 5 or 10 were really experimental. Like, I think we just said yes to anything that anybody would be willing to talk to us about. Nobody believed us when we said that we could do something. So there was a lot of begging and pleading and compromises and discounts and whatever, until we got the first few in. And manufacturing is not a risk-taking sector generally. They want, especially if you're talking about their core production line, they want something that they know is going to work. And so the first 5 or 10.
Is that across all sectors though, or is it across?
I've found that to be relatively true compared to, there are, of course, there are people who are generally forward thinking in manufacturing, but the risk tolerance is much lower than, let's say, a software company or even a financial services company, or, like these other, if you sell to other industries, because manufacturing businesses, for every minute of downtime, there's a huge cost associated with it. So
I meant like across automotives or consumer electronics.
I've found it to be relatively consistent. I mean, automotive is definitely the more demanding of the group in the US. And the reason is because the automotive plants are some of the highest throughput plants. Like, they actually run at full capacity very often. If you look at other industries, that's not typically true. In the US, a lot of other manufacturing sectors, they tend to run their plants, 5-10 hours a day sometimes, or they take, there's not as much of a focus on absolute throughput, absolute productivity. Automotive is demanding, but even across other sectors of manufacturing, still the margins are typically quite low, and so it's very difficult for them to tolerate experimental downtime. They really want to know it works. And so we also didn't know exactly what our product was going to be. We had some general ideas and some philosophies, but we had to do a lot of iteration and testing and trials before we could actually successfully land a project. And even then, the first few deployments didn't go super well, as usual. And so there was a little bit of work, right? So I think the first 10 were, when we started closing those deals, we thought we had it all figured out. Looking back, we were so wrong. And then I think from 10 to 50 was probably the first time where operational scale started to really become painful, because we had to have people who were focused and dedicated on deployment and supply chain and maintenance and monitoring and programming the robots. And the other challenge that happened at that phase is the deployment resources and the R&D and development resources started to compete a lot for resources, right? Because anytime there's a problem with a real customer deployment, that's where the revenue comes from. And so everybody rushes to go and fix that customer's problems, which means people generally get a little bit distracted from core development work. And as a company, always biased towards the place where the revenue is coming from.
Right.
So the projects that have a 1 or 2 or 3 year payoff generally get deprioritized. So I think from 10 to 50 was the time where we were figuring out how to straddle that balance. I would say now that we're at 100 something, 100, 140, 150 customers, that problem still exists for sure. We've just become more conscious about it.
Right.
And so we have to really protect the team that's doing development work and build layers that to run interference for them between kind of real customer problems and kind of development problems. And so getting the products to a level where you don't have to call a software engineer or a robotics engineer to get involved to fix any specific issue. That really had to happen at a lot of scale. So that's, I think, a place where a lot of robotics companies generally fail, is that they develop something that works for a small group or for like an expert user, but it doesn't work for the typical operator on a production floor who maybe this is their first day on the job or the first week on the job, and they have to figure out how to make this robot work. And before this, maybe they were working in an Amazon warehouse or something, right? So that it just has a very different level of polish and performance and reliability that's needed to be able to work on a normal production floor.
When you were graduating from 0 to 10 to 10 to 50, did you already have a sense of your customer in that 10 to 50 phase, or?
I think so. We had, I would say we during that 10 to 50 phase is when it started to become clearer and clearer. We still had a lot of experiments during 10 to 50 where we were selling to customers that looked kind of like our customers, but a little bit different. The big cost of that is actually sales team time, because they end up barking up the wrong tree a lot. They spend hours and hours talking to random customers about random things or really, really complex projects that end up not being a fit for us. And so where we burnt the most amount of money during the 10 to 50 phase was salespeople, because we grew the sales team. This was a mistake I made as the CEO. I thought, okay, we really need to define our ICP. So we need to have as many shots on goal as possible. More shots on goal means we'll learn faster. The reality is it was not systematic shots on goal. It was haphazard, running around talking to people about useless things. And so, it's also a very different kind of salesperson who can do that kind of more experimental discovery sale versus a salesperson who is like trained at a repeatable sales process.
Right.
And what we found is, we were hiring the latter category because they had experience selling something else somewhere else. And they would come and they would get frustrated because they were like, well, what's the product? Why isn't it better defined? Why don't you have a playbook for me? What's the lead generation process like, et cetera? So we learned over time also that we need to bring in salespeople that are a little entrepreneurial, a little bit like, willing to be part of the discovery process, but still can carry a high quality sales conversation and drive the customer, because it really is a skill to drive the customer from indecision to decision. There's a lot of stakeholders and stuff managing that.
So you said something very interesting, which is that these salespeople may have sold something else altogether, right? And so how does one think about getting the right sales hires? Do they have to be specifically from a certain kind of manufacturing? Because manufacturing is broad, but still it's not B2B services, right? It's still similar to what, for instance, like what you may be trying to do will be more similar to Ed's selling, right? Like Machina Labs versus like a Salesforce sale, right? So how do you sort of define the background of a salesperson then?
Yeah, I would say for us, what we found works best is people who, it doesn't really matter what product they sell. but it matters who they were selling to. So if they were selling to a similar audience, then they know the lingo, they understand the anxieties and concerns, and they understand like where those people congregate, you know. So there's a familiarity, you know, they can walk into these factories and they can have some credibility. We found that to be a more important indicator than what specific product it was that they were selling. So we do have a lot of our salespeople used to sell SaaS to factories. They're great, you know. One of our salespeople used to sell cardboard to factories.
Wow.
Fine, you know, like because they understand what the language is, they understand the context. Robotics experience we found is not only is it not very helpful, it's actually counterproductive sometimes because old robotics sales was very focused on the bells and whistles and features of the robot, right? They say, oh, I have a robot that has, you know, 6 degrees of freedom and it has this kind of range of motion and blah, blah. And our product is very different from that, right? Our product is very focused on you're buying performance and you can abstract away the hardware and the complexity of the hardware. That's very difficult for somebody who spent their whole career in robot sales to kind of comprehend and understand. So there's just, you know, there are very big differences. The other thing, this is kind of a cliche line that I had heard many times in the past, but didn't really understand until recently, is that you should hire for slope, not for absolute position. Right? It's kind of common startup trope, but it's very true. Like if you hire for past experience, there are plenty of people with 40 years of experience in some industry, but they are not in a learning mindset and they're not hungry for new information. And so we find that they tend to be less successful than people who maybe have much less experience or maybe have no relevant experience, but have demonstrated a hunger and willingness to learn and to challenge their own assumptions and be wrong. Like a very recent example of that is in AI, right? Like I constantly send our sales team information about new AI tools that I hear about. And it's very stark contrast. For some people, they grab them, they try them, and they say, this one works great. You know, it helped me in such and such a way. And for some people, they say, oh, I've been doing it the same way for 30 years. This thing is never going to work, right? And the results are very correlated with their willingness to. It's not about the AI tool itself. Like maybe the AI tool helps them, but the success is coordinated with people who are hungry for knowledge and humble and willing to learn.
There's also some level of skepticism that creeps in once you've sort of been in an industry for a really long time and then you question all assumptions.
Yeah, you've seen all of the failures, and so you know you try to avoid them, which is a normal human tendency, but actually is dangerous in the startup context because there may be subtle differences that make it different. I don't know if you've seen this. It's like a meme on the internet of like a bunch of people in a startup office, and they all look like tired and ragged, and you know they're sitting there working, and there's a big banner in the background that says, "We do this not because it's easy, but because we thought it was going to be easy." I think it's very true for most startups, right? We underestimate the complexity of it, but that's also what allowed us to get started in the first place.
Yeah, constructive problem solving, I guess. But it's you know, one of the reasons. So you obviously talked about failures of certain startups and why they tend to have a really hard time integrating with the larger facilities or the customers' facilities or factories. What do you think, or what have you observed from the investments that you've made or the people that you've helped? Are you know, things that startup founders, robotics founders tend to underestimate when they want to integrate their solutions into customer factories?
There are a lot of different things. I'm trying to shorten the list. I think the most, one of the failure modes I've seen a lot in robotics is when software people try to deploy robots. And again, they're extremely brilliant often, but they often don't know what the real world complexities are. And then they end up being frustrated that the factory conditions are not the same as the lab conditions. And I'll give you a bunch of simple examples. Like our robots pick up a lot of boxes.
Right.
The most common reason that the robot fails is if the tape on the box has not been applied properly. So the robot tries to pick up the box, and the bottom opens up, and everything falls out. So it's not something that the software engineers had considered.
Right.
Because they were like, in their modeling, they had boxes show up and boxes picked up, and they're like, the robot can pick it up. Like, what's the problem? It works very reliably. So, that's one example of maybe 100 little things that go wrong on a factory floor that need to be accounted for. Another example is, you may say, oh, the robot looks like it'll fit in this room. No problem. But in practice, like the doorway coming into this room might be too small. And so the robot can't fit through the door.
Right.
So you're looking at the floor plan, you say, oh, like it'll fit here, no problem, everything's fine.
Yeah.
But you then have to realize that actually there's a whole bunch of upstream dependencies that are important. All of those, again, none of them by itself is rocket science. But when you stack up enough of them, it can mean the difference between success and failure for a startup. And a lot of companies that I've seen have failed in those things, where they just miss enough of those details and they lose customer trust. And then you get kicked out and you never get invited back.
You talked about robotics as a service. And obviously, like your model also, in your model, you also help provide financing to your customers. But how do you think about your financing, and how has it changed over the years, right? Like maybe with regards to your business scaling, that'd be an interesting point of view from you.
I think that one of the things that startup founders typically get wrong is they apply the software model to everything, right? And in the software model, the majority of your expenses are labor, right? Or human expense. Like you're paying for software engineers, maybe you're paying for some server space, etc. And so as a result, venture dollars and equity dollars are the best way to fund that stuff because it's highly uncertain, generally long-term payback, unpredictable payback. You can't say I hired this software engineer and this software engineer is going to generate $1 million of revenue for me. Like it's not correlated, right? That software engineer will do whatever it does, and then hopefully the product generates revenue for you in the future. And so the thing that I think a lot of startup founders get wrong is they think of all capital needs as equity needs. The reality is it's not efficient at all, typically, to use equity for everything. So typically companies need a mix of equity and debt, and like debt goes to fund these highly predictable revenue generating assets, and equity goes to fund the more speculative work. So you need kind of a variety.
And at what point do you start thinking about capital formation sources other than equity, right? Like, is there a timing to it? How do you integrate that into your business plan?
I think you have to do it from the beginning.
Right.
You have to come to the table with financial sophistication about how you're going to fund this business. Equity investors want to know, and you have to build your structure and your contract. Everything has to be built to support that from the beginning. If you expect to use debt capital in the future, or asset financing, or asset securitization, or these other things, your customer contract needs to look different. Your insurance requirements are different. Your like the way that you pay taxes needs to look different. Like every aspect of your business has to support that. And typically, a lot of startup founders don't think that through in the beginning. Now, like there's the counter argument to it, which is there's a lot of discovery work that you have to do in the beginning as well, which is you have to try different customers, different contract types, figure out what sells, and find product market fit. So um, I think you have to think about it from day one, but you probably shouldn't build it on day one. You probably build it little by little over time.
And do you need a different kind of skill? Does a founder know? Because
The main thing is you need a good CFO,
you need a good CFO.
especially if you're doing anything hardware related, you need a much better CFO than if you're doing only software related things.
From
That's
an
the
early
same.
stage.
Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. Never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
Do you think it helped that you were VC before?
I think it helped and hurt. I think it helped in the sense that it I knew kind of what people were looking for and I knew how to talk to investors and frame the story. Um, it hurt in a different context, which is uh, you know, I had seen enough failures of other kinds of robotics companies that I spent as an investor, I spent a lot of my time investing in robotics. So I like to think of myself like I knew a lot of the nuances between these companies. And so when I would talk about Formic, I would talk about us in the context of all these details. The reality is most investors spend very little of their time thinking about robotics.
Right.
And so it was actually a challenge for me to zoom out enough and say, okay, how does an investor who hasn't been thinking about this problem for the last 10 years approach it? And how can I help them?
I think just moving on to one of the most important stakeholders when it comes to robotics deployment, the system integrators. And system integrators, are these stakeholders that are directly in contact with OEMs and kind of understand, okay, what the system architecture would look like, right? And therefore, they are also incentivized not to encourage any novel innovation coming into factories because their reliability or OEMs, reliance on them is everything, right, to them and to their business model and revenues. And so, but I also believe that they are extremely, or they could be extremely great stakeholders when it comes to distribution in specific. So how do we sort of deal with this tension, right? Like how should startups really think about working with these system integrators potentially? Because they are great.
I would say the one thing you should never do as a startup is rely on a system integrator to sell on your behalf. You can use system integrators to help you deliver your service, but I think where a lot of startups have gone wrong is that they assume that, oh, well, this system integrator sells to Ford or General Motors all the time. So maybe if I give them this, they'll do it for me as well. It's just never going to happen. And that actually generalizes beyond system integrators to kind of any channel. Right? I think it's a really bad idea for a startup to start their life thinking about channel partnerships and having somebody else sell on their behalf. Um, it could come later in their life as a company, and it could be something that will help accelerate scale. But early on, you just have to have your finger on the pulse of what the customer is saying. You have to use that to iterate on your product. You have to change. Your organization has to really have their ear to the ground and hear what the customer is saying and be able to respond to it.
And with the, say, for instance, if a startup wants to work with the bigger OEMs like Toyota, Ford, etc., they all have their innovation centers. We've just discussed that. And so, do you have an example of a company that has been able to work successfully at scale with some of these customers by just directly working with them versus engaging in any other kind of relationship?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Ed at Machina is a fantastic example.
Yeah.
I think they did brilliant work, and they announced a big partnership with Toyota recently. And the early days of that were, I think, Ed and the whole team at Machina had enormous focus and like determination to get that to work. Even I was at the time I was on the board of Machina, and I remember everybody in the board meeting said like, why are you chasing this thing? Right? It's like it's going to be impossible. It's going to be so hard. You're not going to change their behavior. But Ed had a vision and was determined, and uh, they've shown online now they've made a custom car basically.
For Toyota.
But it was originally not. I mean, it wasn't a contracted thing for Toyota, right? So he did it. Yeah. He had decided he was going to do it, and then brought Toyota along for the ride after, right? And that's really unique because he showed them something that was possible that they themselves maybe hadn't imagined was possible. That's really the way to do it. Right? I think some of these companies, they show up at Toyota and they say, "Oh, I have a way to do your inspection 10% faster than you're doing it today." Like nobody there is going to care. They're not going to trust you. They're not going to believe you. They're not going to want it. They're not going to be able to integrate it. Like it's just you're too far from a workable solution for them.
What do you have to say about founders selling software solutions to OEMs and not being from a manufacturing background? Because I've also heard examples of people or founders not going to an OEM, but just selling a software product because they have access to the OEM over a Zoom call. So how does that work?
I mean, I think many founders don't have backgrounds from the manufacturing sector and can sell successfully. I mean, it's related. It's the same as the slope thing, right? Like the experience actually doesn't matter. The rate of learning matters a lot, and I think for founders even more so than employees. Like for the founder, you constantly have to be willing to throw out everything that you thought you knew, and change your mind. And so that's what I've observed in the best founders is that they're on the one hand, like Ed, when they decide something is right, they can be very, very determined to drive it to completion. But on the other hand, they have to start with a very curious and hungry mind and ask a lot of questions and interview a lot of people. And so, it takes a lot of work and time to actually go and learn an industry and be able to speak in their lingo and speak with credibility.
Yeah. How do you think the model of system integration is changing, if at all?
System integration is slowly becoming a non-existent need.
Yeah.
We see this in consumer software or SaaS already to the large degree, right? Every major SaaS company in the world has now announced a command line interface because they want the agents to be able to interface with it seamlessly. Right. Like Salesforce did this headless CRM, and every company basically, Google Workspace has a command line interface. And so now my AI agent on my computer can go and talk to all of them. Yeah. I don't have to integrate anything, right? I just send a link of the documentation to my AI agent. It learns it, and then now I can do all the stuff. So the need for software to software integration has mostly gone away. It used to be that Salesforce had to develop a custom integration for Zapier and a custom integration for Notion and a custom integration for Google and a custom integration for Slack. And that need has completely gone away. Right. I think the same thing is true for industrial technologies. It's definitely not as fast, right? And a lot of the traditional like hardware and software providers to manufacturing, they really value their vendor lock-in, right? So for example, Siemens, you have to use the Siemens software to program the Siemens PLC. You have to use the Siemens language for this. And you have to get certified and trained. And if you use the Siemens this thing, then you have to use the Siemens that thing, and you have to use the other thing from Siemens. Like it's not very interoperable. Everybody has their own language. Everybody has their own infrastructure. On the software side, it's even worse, right? Like SolidWorks and Autodesk and these guys. Like when you're in that vendor ecosystem, you're locked in. I think that creates either an opportunity for startups to say, hey, we'll be like the open-ended, very easily integrated version of this, or they can create tools for those big guys, the ones that are willing and open-minded to become more like AI native, AI friendly. But I think that the work that integrators used to do is quickly becoming extinct, frankly, kind of like the work that management consultants used to do, right? Like sometimes you need somebody, yeah, sometimes you need somebody else to do some of the mapping work, and like the human aspects of consulting are still valuable. Like they can go and interview and they can ask questions and things that you might not be able to do on your own. But at the end of the day, um, yeah, like so much work that you used to pay other people to do, you should do yourself now. And this is something I'm advocating to our team heavily is, uh, you want to go through an audit, like, AI could do the majority of the work. Yeah. You want to do procurement, or every aspect. So I think we're in a really interesting era.
Do you have a uniform way of using AI across your team, or is it based on an individual?
It's not a unified way yet. We've kind of gone about it in phases. Phase one was I used AI for a lot of stuff, and then I would go around and advocate for it. Right, I would tell people, hey, you can do this with AI, you can do that with AI, and then we did a management offsite where I brought all my leadership team together, and I locked the door and I said, you're not leaving here until you use AI to automate one of your workflows. Yeah. And so we sat there and we helped them to get it going, right? But that one session, it took like 2-3 hours, and everybody was able to build some awesome AI tool. And that unlocked people's ideas around what was possible. So then for a few months after that, people kept building stuff and we let it be a little bit organic. And then once it started to get to a certain scale, then I brought in a full-time person. So we recently hired one person, and his only job is to help people in the company automate their processes and workflows and tasks with AI, and to build common infrastructure across them. So the thing that we're working on now is we have a common context database and a common skills database that everybody in the company can access and use. And the context database includes like all the data sources and everything. So it's all plugged in, all the integrations are ready. And then if any team, the finance team wants to create a dashboard, or the procurement team wants to automate something, or the deployment team wants to automate something, they can pull from those two, they can build whatever they need, and it kind of feeds back into that. And so we built this kind of master structure that now is starting to unify. And so now we're slowly starting to get to what you described, which is like now we're starting to get to a place where we have a standard around how to do it. But I mean, the reality is like I think it's probably going to change again every 6 months. We have to throw it all out.
But at least you have a very intuitive framework, right? Like you have context and skills. So this is a good framework to start with for sure, and then scale it up gradually. So I love that.
We're trying.
I think one thing that you said is that for folks who are focused on the long-term customer service matters, right? And so how did you build up your customer service team, starting from when you were at probably first customer to where you are now?
Super good question. So we always knew that maintenance for the robots was going to be important. So from the very early days, we had people who would help us with keeping the robots up and running. What we realized over time is that that wasn't sufficient. It was necessary, but not sufficient. Customer success, customer service, customer management is about helping them understand the value of this robot in their factory, and understanding what their true anxieties and pain points are at a much deeper level than just saying, hey, yeah, the robot's working. Yeah. So the first customer success hire that we made was actually unexpected. So we tried to sell robots to this one factory, and we weren't successful. But the plant manager there said, hey, can I come work for you guys? Because I love what you guys are doing. And I didn't buy, but I'll come and I'll tell you why. And it was fantastic. And so he came, he was from that world. He was able to understand the needs of the customers. He was able to walk in the door with a ton of credibility, and was also able to really help us improve our product and define it in a way that responded to that customer's needs. Eventually, we asked him to be our head of product. So he ran our product team for a while, and now he's our COO. And so now he's running almost all the operational aspects of our business. And I think a lot of the success that he's had is because he understands that customer really well. Since then, we have new folks on our customer success team as well. Many of them do come from production backgrounds, so they've been in the shoes of the operators and the plant managers and the line managers. So they really understand what they think about, what they care about, and how to communicate with them and share the value. And that has turned out to be critically important for us. So in 2025, I think 50% of our sales were expansions within existing customers. And I think for 2026, it'll probably be similar. That only comes as a result of really having a trusted relationship with the customer. We also have basically no churn. We have a 97% renewal rate, again, in large part thanks to the work with the customer success team, because they understand what the issues are. They surface them to us long before it becomes an issue.
How often does this team speak with the customer?
Generally, it's either monthly or quarterly, depending on what kind of cycle. But we also do a thing called hypercare, which is right after a deployment for the first roughly 2 months. They basically do at least a weekly touch base with the customer and like are really on top of everything. They have a list every morning of here are your hypercare customers, pay attention, talk to them, make sure you know what's going on. And then we also do hypercare when there are major like either upgrades or changes or the customer's changing something about the production that we need to know. Then you kind of put them back in that hypercare category. So they get basically ultra high touch attention.
And is this term an internal term, or do you also tell the customers as well? Hypercare.
It's mostly an internal term. I think we've probably used it with some customers, but yeah, I mean, for them, it's always hypercare.
So what is RaaS?
So RaaS is, I think, on the one hand, it's just like a different pricing model for robots. I think in reality, it's a way to offset risk and adoption complexity for customers. And for a lot of our customers, it's basically this kind of on-demand worker robot that can show up and do any task. And as we add new types of robots to the fleet, we can offer RaaS for more and more types of things.
What kind of companies should adopt RaaS?
As buyers or as sellers?
Sellers.
I have a kind of an extreme opinion about this. I know it's not the common opinion, but I think my slightly controversial opinion is that anybody who really cares about their customer being successful with their robot should do it as a service. I think the kind of CapEx style model has a fundamental flaw, which is once you've sold it, you've made your money.
Yeah.
And even if you really care about your customer, you're not financially incentivized to constantly make their experience better. And I think a lot of factories have suffered the consequences of that single, like it's just a small incentive misalignment. The customer needs to use it every single day, and they want it to perform every single day. And I think when you offer RaaS, like you're also accountable for performance every single day.
And you kind of underwrite integration risk, right? In this case, versus exactly what you said. Had it been a non-RaaS model, the customer ultimately would have had to underwrite whatever you're offering. And so when you are evaluating a new project or a new customer, then how do you do that? How do you underwrite a customer?
So I'll say two things. The first is you're absolutely right. We underwrite a lot of risks. Integration risk is one of them. We underwrite operational risks. We underwrite, hardware risk. We underwrite performance risk. The question is, who's best positioned to underwrite and evaluate that risk? Is it the customer who makes chocolate chip cookies, or is it me who deploys robots every day? We know 10 times more about the robots, or 100 times more. It's the same thing as, when I use AWS, AWS underwrites, a lot of risks, right? They underwrite the risk of performance of the server. They underwrite the risk of performance of their fiber optic line. They underwrite the risk of their air conditioner system and their data center breaking. Right. But they're qualified to take those risks because that's what they do. That's their job. I think if they were to say, hey, Formic, I'll provide you a service level agreement on your cloud services, except for in the case that my air conditioner breaks, in which case I'm not going to, I'll say, fuck you. You know, like, no way. Hey, it's part of the deal. If you're taking on performance, you take on all the performance risk, right? And I think it's the same thing here with robots, right? Like the customer is not generally qualified to underwrite those risks. So sorry, I didn't answer directly your question. So we have to, in order to underwrite that risk, we have to evaluate the application thoroughly. We have to understand that there's floor space available. We have to understand what the other machinery is that we have to interface with. We have to understand what the products are that the robot's picking up. We have to understand all of those different aspects. So we built a lot of software to automate that work. So basically, if this was an insurance company, we would call it automated underwriting software. This is a robotics company, we call it solutioning software, but it's the same idea, right? It's we make sure that we have a solution that's going to work.
When you first explained the concept of RaaS to maybe your first funder, or maybe I'm not sure who you took a loan or whatever for specifically financing your customers, specifically for that. So how did the capital providers react?
Yeah, so I think it's raising money from debt providers is very different from raising money from equity. For equity, you know, we tell the story of the future, all the exciting, amazing things that it's going to be one day, and people, you know, either believe you or they don't. On the debt side, it's very different. We say, this is super boring. This is just like all these other things that you've done. Hey, you financed photocopiers. Hey, you financed shipping containers. Hey, you financed rail cars. Look at all the ways in which we are the same as them. And that's really how you get access to capital, because you know, they're not going to invent a new category for you who's a nothing startup with no volume. You know, you like they'll invent a new category. You can say, I'll bring you $100 million of business. If you say I'm going to do 1 million of business, like they're not going to take on any real risk.
What do you do to relax?
Mostly work. Like when I have anxiety, working is the only thing that makes me less anxious. So that's the primary thing. But yeah, you know, play with my kids. I have 2 kids, and
how old are they?
I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old.
Oh wow, they're tiny miny.
Yeah, and I have one more coming actually.
Oh wow, congrats.
Thank you. So that's, you know, the best thing, or hiking, nature, you know, all the normal stuff.
Yeah. We're also in California, so
yes.
it helps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good weather helps a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Saman. This was really wonderful, and thank you for hosting me here.
Yeah, thank you for coming all the way.
No,
It was a lot
absolutely.
of fun.
Yeah. Thank you.